Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israel's coronavirus infection rate remains at an all-time high despite our world-leading vaccination drive, which foreign leaders are all looking to reproduce. Meanwhile, Defense Minister Benny Gantz calls for renewed unity ahead of the upcoming elections, despite himself fighting to just stay in the race. And finally, Israel's foreign ministry revealing the legwork that went into the priming the Middle East for the historic Abraham peace accords. Now, to begin, Sheldon Adelson, a close friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu's, passed away at the age of 87 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma on Tuesday. The United States businessman and philanthropist was a well-known casino mogul and political donor, and his passing comes just after purchasing outgoing U.S. Ambassador David Friedman's home in Herzliya last week for over $67 million, as well as providing a private Aliyah flight for convicted spy Jonathan Pollard and his wife Esther at the beginning of the month. Prime Minister Netanyahu with some remarks in commemoration.
קשה לתאר את מה ששלדון עשה בשביל העם היהודי ומדינת ישראל. שלדון היה פטריוט יהודי ענק, והוא פעל לחיזוקה של מדינת ישראל, לחיזוק מעמדה בארצות הברית, לחיזוק הקשר עם התפוצות.
Moving on, Israel's seeing over 9,000 new daily cases of coronavirus for the second day in a row, for a positivity rate of 7.6%. This bringing the total number of infections to nearly 514,000 cases, over 77,000 active, 1,100 in serious condition, and 3,772 killed. Meanwhile, in light of the recent spikes, health officials are toying with extending the harsh lockdown restrictions. Public Health Services head Dr. Sheldon saying that it's impossible to imagine that we would exit lockdown in 10 days. And Prime Minister Benny Netanyahu again reminding the country to remain vigilant.
אנחנו יכולים לנצח, אבל כדי לנצח אנחנו צריכים לעשות שני דברים וצריך לעשות אותם יחד. הדבר הראשון הוא לבוא ולהתחסן. אני חושב שכאן אין צורך להכביר מילים, הציבור בישראל נרתם לעניין. אבל הדבר השני שצריך לעשות זה להקפיד על הכללים. להקפיד על הכללים משני טעמים שאינם ברורים. הדבר הראשון הוא, אף אחד לא יודע בדיוק מתי הוא מתחסן, זה ייקח זמן. הדבר השני הוא שאין ודאות לכך, ויש גם ספק רב בכך, שמי שיתחסן הוא לא נושא את המחלה בעצמו. הנגיף יכול לתקוף אותך, אתה תהיה מחוסן, אבל אתה יכול להעביר את הנגיף למישהו אחר.
Well, speaking of our vaccination program, whether fast enough or not, it is the fastest in the world, and the world is taking notice, as Prime Minister Benny Netanyahu is again pointing out on social media.
We've seen the incredible speed and efficiency of Israel's vaccination drive, which is on track to vaccinate all over 16s by the end of March. So what discussions has my honourable friend had with his Israeli counterpart on replicating Israel's success, particularly in the areas of digitisation and accessibility?
I commend the Israeli government and the Israeli health service for a stellar job in vaccinating the most vulnerable communities, and we have a lot to learn from other countries, including the throughput, the speed at which they manage to vaccinate.
High praises from the UK, among other nations, looking at Israel for lessons in fighting the coronavirus pandemic, with Israel now having vaccinated at least 22.3% of the population in just about 3 weeks' time. But so what's the answer to the MP's query? How, in fact, did Israel get its vaccine campaign to work so quickly? Well, one factor was population size and density. For Israel, 20% of the population translates to about 2 million people, the majority of whom live in big cities and across an area about the size of New Jersey. This means that the percent vaccinated rises much faster relative to larger countries, and that it's cheaper and faster to deliver the vaccines to where they need to go without letting them spoil by temperatures above minus 70 degrees Celsius. Still, that's far from the whole story, too. Israel innovatively divided the vaccine shipments into smaller, more manageable sizes to deliver only what was necessary to each community and cut down on potential spoilage. As for administration of the doses, Israel's existing healthcare infrastructure played a very large role. Every Israeli must choose to be a member of one of 4 not-for-profit health insurance HMOs. And these same HMOs, rather than the government, are primarily in charge of organizing and personally contacting at-risk populations in order of priority.
אנחנו מקדימים את כל העולם בחיסונים, עם מיליוני החיסונים שהבאנו, וקופות החולים והמערך הרפואי שלנו עושים עבודה הירואית, שכרגע תגיע, אני מקווה עד מחר, מחרתיים לכל יותר, ל-170,000 חיסונים ביום שיא עולמי. אבל באותה עת אנחנו נלחמים גם בהתפשטות המחלה שהגיעה כבר ל10,000 חולים מאומתים ביום. זה קצב גדול מאוד.
But finally, Israel led the world in yet two other challenges. First, changing the attitude of the public away from skepticism and fear with an aggressive online and community-based information campaign. And second, simply receiving large stocks of the vaccinations through a number of partnerships and agreements with Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna. Reports showing that Israel paid upwards of $20 more per person for the vaccines to ensure their priority delivery, while promising, at least to Pfizer, to provide the company with access to medical data and information about those who get the vaccine, essentially turning Israel into a testing ground for developing future vaccine strategies. In other news, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's trial hearing for one of 3 corruption charges against him has been set now for February 8th, just 6 weeks ahead of March elections. Hannah Rifkin reports.
Anti-Netanyahu protesters again congregating outside the Prime Minister's official residence in Jerusalem, demonstrating against the latest postponement of the Prime Minister's coming court hearing. Originally set for today, the trial hearing is being delayed until February 8th, partly because of coronavirus lockdowns and partly to give Netanyahu's legal counsel time to review and respond to the latest updated indictments. Though protesters argue that this is just another attempt to avoid or delay justice. Meanwhile, adding to the chorus of opposition, Defense Minister and Blue and White Party leader Benny Gantz is urging center and center-left parties to do as he says and not as he does, and to unite against Netanyahu in the coming elections. Gantz telling the nation that he was wrong to, quote, shake the hand of the man he pledged to replace and a serial promise breaker, but Gantz's message of unity seems to be largely falling on deaf ears. Yisrael Beitenu leader Avigdor Lieberman, for one, saying that we had an opportunity to replace Netanyahu, but that Gantz chose instead to become reserve prime minister, adding that the only thing that Gantz can do now for the country is drop out of the race. And this being a sentiment seemingly reflected in the polls, where Gantz's Blue and White Party has slumped to last place with just 5 Knesset mandates. That said, Gantz does still have some following, unlike 7 other parties that are not expected to cross the electoral threshold, including Telem, the National Union, the New Economic Party, Gesher, Tnufa, Otzma Yehudit, and Labor. Labor Party leader Amir Peretz now also adding that he will not even be running in the vote.
And joining us now with more on the recent earthquakes from the campaign trail, Director of English Operations for the Yaumim Party, Jeremy Salton. Jeremy, thanks for being with us again. Now, starting with your Yaumim Party, according to the polls coming out on Channel 12 last night, it seems like you're stuck more or less in the same spot, and that Naftali Bennett, your chairman, is still far from the dream of prime minister. Do you think that's going to change?
Well, what we see in the polls right now is that we're in third place, and we see that Gideon Sa'ar is losing steam, and he's dropping to second place in a place which is really within the margin of error of where we are at the moment. And we see this a lot when it comes to new parties, where they start very high, and then as time goes on and people get to know the players and the positions of the party, things tend to go down a little bit. So I think this is still a wide open race. Right now, yes, it's a 3-man race for prime minister. It does not seem like anyone in the center left is going to get their act together and unite, and they remain below the 3 parties running to their right. And I expect that we will be able to pick up once we get to the submission of the party lists and we go ahead and we explain what slate we're running for this election.
Well, in addition to the polls I just mentioned, Channel 12 is also optioning what would happen if Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party and Bennett's Yaumim Party, your Yaumim Party, actually joined together. Do you see this as a possible scenario?
Look, that's what they love doing right now. All of the TV stations are running scenario polling in which they say, well, what happens if X goes with Y or if A goes with B? We're dealing with reality, and the reality is that we have separate parties across the political spectrum. If before the last election we saw a situation of parties getting together and merging ahead of the election. And of course, the historic time where only 8 lists entered the current Knesset. So now we have a situation where we're probably going to go in the other direction in terms of historic proportions, where we just have practically at this point 24 different parties running for Knesset, which are considered to be within about 1% of polling, which is something that we've never been in before. So I don't think we're going to see really any more mergers, at least not throughout January. The submission of the list deadline is February 4th. It's possible we'll see a few of those things happening in the last days, but more likely we might see even more splits before we even see any mergers.
All right, well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your insights. And everybody watching at home, for more, please make sure to visit our new and improved website at ILTV.tv. Make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for daily updates while you're there. Now, meanwhile, to the north, Syrian news reports are alleging that Israeli planes struck targets in the Deir ez-Zor region of eastern Syria near the Syria-Iraq border Tuesday night. And approximately 30 people were allegedly killed in these strikes. Pictures circulated by Iran-backed terror proxy Hezbollah also showing extensive damages to their warehouses. And this as the Lebanese president's office gets ready to file an urgent complaint with the UN against what it calls Israel's daily violations of its airspace. Joining us to expand on these issues is former commander of the Tel Aviv Air Base, Brigadier General in the Reserves, Israel Relik Shafir. Thank you so much for being with us, Brigadier General. Now, according to the report, the Israeli airstrikes are not far from where the old Syrian nuclear reactor was being built and bombed in 2007. Could it be that Iran is trying to rebuild a reactor in that area?
I doubt very much if this is the case. I think they're probably trying to establish a stronghold that they may think was unnoticed. So I doubt that any rebuilding is taking place.
All right. Well, could the increasing rate of these alleged, attacks over the last month be in light of the last days of the Trump administration?
I think everybody understands that the 20th of January is a test. And so everybody's vying for positions, whether it be the Iranians, Hezbollah, or ourselves, the Israelis. So in light of these, all the changes and the manipulations and the quotes should be seen in light of the unknown of what will be Biden's position come the inauguration date.
All right, fair enough. So let's move a little bit now to Lebanon. Lebanon again is complaining to the UN about Israeli violations of its airspace, alleged Israeli violations of its airspace. How do the recent attacks maybe line up or bode with this complaint?
I think it goes with the same frame that we've just spoken about. If Lebanon is able to get its case, and when I say Lebanon, it's the Hezbollah, are trying to put their position in the spotlight come the Biden era, then that will think that this may change the outlook of the new administration coming in into who is the good guy and who's the bad guy in this scenario. So in light of this, I wouldn't take this too seriously.
Do you see any alternative ways other than airstrikes that Israel is going to maybe try to stop the attempts of Iran and Hezbollah to build themselves up in Syria?
So far, it looks to the outside viewer that those attacks are taking a toll and are creating pressure on the Iranians and on the Syrians, and certainly on Hezbollah, in taking the position of what is going to happen in the coming year in our area. Who's going to have the upper hand? Will the U.S. step in and be more active than it was before? What is going to take place with the nuclear deal with Iran? What are the latitudes that are going to, the pressures that are going to be exerted within the next few months? So this is all a connected system.
All right, well, it's going to be really interesting to see how these attacks continue throughout the region in the coming months, especially, as you say, as the Biden administration begins. Until then, Brigadier General, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
In other news, as clashes between Israel and some in the Arab world continue, other Arab nations are closer than ever with the Jewish state. Especially in the wake of the historic Abraham Peace Accords, and particularly on the individual level, things could not be better between Israelis and their Arab neighbors in the region. But not out of nowhere. The new ties are in large part thanks to Israel's aggressive social media campaigning. A small Arabic-speaking team organized within the Israeli Foreign Ministry, focusing solely on promoting interreligious relations and ending decades of hostilities.
Most of the countries in the Arab world don't have official relations with Israel, so the social media was like a big earthquake for us in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it let us the opportunity to talk directly to audiences in the Arab world and to present the real face of Israel.
انتم شايفين احنا موجودين في سوق محنة يهودا، احنا بنيجي على اماكن عديده في دوله اسرائيل لنفرجي الحياه الاسرائيليه، حياه المواطن الحقيقي والبسيط في دوله اسرائيل والتعايش بين العرب واليهود مع بعض، وبهاي الطريقه احنا بنشكل سفراء في العالم الافتراضي لدوله اسرائيل، وعن طريق هيك ايضا بنبني جسور بين الثقافات بين الشعوب بعيدا عن كل السياسات.
I think engagement, interactions and dialogue with audiences in the Arab world is in top priority here in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And at the end of the day, Israel, its neighbors are Arab states. We are in the Middle East, and we need to talk to each other in order to understand each other better, in order to create a good basis for any future peace deals with our neighbors.
But with that in mind, the question then is, why did this push only begin fairly recently, with the unit established in 2011 but only ramping up its activities in late 2020? The answer lies in Egypt and Jordan. Israel wants to gain a broader Arab support than we get through these so-called cold pieces between Israel and these two countries, where the governments uphold all of the treaties, but where the citizens still largely reject normalization. And the change in tact is paying off. Research showing anti-normalization commentary in Arabic dropping from 90% to 75% in just the span of a few months, and with both Israelis and their new Arabic families sharing the same sentiments.
سافرت للإمارات، حسيت حالي أمان في أكثر بكثير من دول في أوروبا. الشعب الإماراتي شعب كثير محترم اللي بتقبل، يعني شعب اللي حتى هن كأشخاص في الدولة عايشين عندك أكثر من 200 هوية، اللي بتحس حالك حدا غريب، بتحسش حالك حدا اللي مش من هاي الدولة، بتحس حالك جزء من المحل اللي أنت فيه، بخلوك تحس إنك أنت في البيت.
It's the first time here to be in Israel, and we would love to say thank you for each and every person who welcomed us.
All right, now yesterday on ILTV's Insider, we discussed the possibility of elections in the Palestinian Authority and their effect on the region and on Israel. And looking meanwhile at the Arab world's evolution in light of the Abraham Accords, the Palestinians are asking the Arab world again, what about us? When is our turn? Well, joining us to talk about the answers to these questions as best as we can gather through social media and caricatures from the Arab world is Middle East and Arab world lecturer and analyst Noam Bennett. Noam, thank you so much for being with us. Now, all right, do you see the Palestinians crying out for peace on social media?
We can see expectation of reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, but I think the public learned from experience. It's not the first, second, or fifth time that we see both parties trying to become closer, thinking about maybe a joint government, but it didn't happen. After many times they tried and it didn't happen.
All right, now we see a couple of these characters on screen, and it's showing maybe a little bit of a differing narrative. Is the call for peace amongst the Palestinians, is that bigger than the call for new elections in the PA? Or is the call for peace, maybe bigger than the call for continued conflict?
I think that one is related to the other. You need to see this perspective and with 2 points. One, in 2007, there was the coup of Hamas, and where they threw the people of Fatah from the roofs and took over the Gaza Strip. And the other is the blockade of the Arab countries on Qatar was done after 3.5 years. So just exactly as you said in your first question, the people, the Palestinians asked, what's going on? 3.5 years they had a thing in the Gulf, and what about us? And the Hamas, the big question that Hamas is trying to figure is how can they get more legitimate through the world? And one of the things are to do it is elections.
All right, well, so with that in mind, if there were an election in the Palestinian Authority today, which of course many people speculate on the chances of that actually coming to fruition, how would Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas fare?
There's many polls, and we know it's we need to be very careful when we listen to them. You need to remember that the talks about elections, we need to remember that in a week we have the new administration in the United States. That's one of the reasons that Mahmoud Abbas is talking about elections again. They want to get a couple of gestures towards the PA after what Trump did to them. And to your question, I'm very careful to predict especially about the future. So it's very hard to know what will happen. But we know that Hamas is getting stronger. Abbas is very old. People are talking all the time about the day after him going. So it's not a surprise that he's waiting for this election than more than 10 years because he's very afraid of what will happen.
Well, so what, you mentioned, of course, the polls right now, which are showing that Hamas is polling quite strongly. What are the Palestinians on the ground saying maybe privately? Is that any different? I'm not in any connection with people on the ground, so I can't really answer that question. I can tell you that through the political cartoons, we can see cartoons that are talking about the reconciliation they wanted, and there are also, but through both sides, but there are also political cartoons that are mocking the idea of reconciliation. As I said, we were there already. It's not new. We will be devastated again that it's not working. So we need to wait and see. All right, Noam Bennett, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on, as we all no doubt already know, the coronavirus has been devastating across the globe. But the ecosystem and the environment in general is likely to feel the effects the most and for the longest time to come. PPE and masks in particular becoming the leading litter produced by the ongoing pandemic as single-use plastic face coverings make their way to every corner of the earth on land and at sea. And tragic images popping up on social media show dead or injured animal life caused by getting caught in or eating said masks. But thankfully, there is at least a little something that we can do to help. For one, unless you really need them, opt for just washing your hands more often instead of wearing single-use gloves. And as for masks, try to switch to reusable cloth-based coverings if you haven't already, or at least cut the strings off of your single-use masks before you recycle them or throw them away. This will greatly reduce the number of animals ensnared by the straps. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be partly cloudy and cool with lows around 54 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect partly cloudy skies and a slight chance of rain around Haifa, and a drop in average temperatures for a high of about 61 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. And now before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Now this is what happens when an IDF soldier returns home after a year.
Oh my God!
All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.14 shekels to the American dollar and 2.46 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Then don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and let us know what you think. Subscribe to our newsletter, by the way, for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Stay safe. Thank you so much for watching.